So here we have the completed vintage Team Losi XX mid-motor conversion. I made a few changes to the front end since the last video, and I moved the electronics around, and that's basically it as far as completing the build. So let me go over a few things. Number one, as you may remember, I have the speed control on this side and the receiver on this side. I swapped them so that way I could at least have air coming in from the back that the fan can feed to the speed control if I need to cool this down. Previously the speed control was over here and this fan was mounted here because the body is pretty short and it would not allow for having the fan mounted on top, and even if I could fit it there, there'd be nowhere for the air to come from. So if I move it to this side, I can cut out part of the body back here and have an opening for air to come in and cool down the speed control, while also having enough of an opening on this side for this fan to cool down the motor. Okay, so that's how I set this up. As far as the battery mount, this is, I've been using these a lot lately. This is just a Kyosho RB6 style battery holder, and then on the back two screws for this brace here, I have a 3x16 millimeter grub screws. I just slot those in. Previously there was a 440 screw that was holding this down, but then you take some thumb screws and you as you mount the Kyosho battery holder, this actually slots right in. It fits perfectly in terms of the hole placement. Then you just screw the thumb screws down, and that will hold, effectively tighten down the back portion here for the screw that holds in this brace. Okay, so that's all set. I have it currently. I'm thinking of mounting the battery more towards the rear, so I have a little foam spacer up here that'll push the battery back. This is the perfect spacing here to fit a shorty. I have two types of shorties, a 4.2 amp hour shorty and I think like a 3.2 amp hour shorty. That one is thinner, so that's why I have this little foam spacer here. If I use the thinner shorty, I just take this and flip it around to pick up any slack between the top of that battery and the bottom of this battery holder. Okay, right now this is a little bit loose. I might want to fiddle around with that to make that fit better. On the front, what did I do? So first thing is I changed the shock bushing arrangement for the front shocks. And by the way, the rear shocks also have a slightly different arrangement. So the standard shock bushings that come with the Losi XX is this style here, where basically this is the part of the bushing that mounts onto the shock, and this part here screws against the shock tower and acts as basically the nut that tightens down the screw and this nut slash bushing, if you will, against the tower. The problem is, because this is only plastic, I found that it tends to come loose when you try to tighten down a lock nut at the end of this screw to tighten the screw down, or to tighten down the assembly here. So on the rear, what I did is I just used a longer screw and I used some 440 nuts to tighten that down against the tower, as you would typically have on like an RC10, for example. And then I took a different style Losi shock bushing. I think this shock bushing here would be for the XX. It doesn't have that nut or that hex style arrangement at the end. It's slightly shorter, and I just run it basically inside out with the thick part at the front. So that slots in, and then I put a lock nut here. On the front, what I did is, even if I had this kind of bushing, it would be, I think, a bit too thick, but I also don't have another one of those. But what I found was that the vintage Yokomo shock bushings are actually a perfect fit into the hole here for the top of the shock body. So I did the same thing. I used, I have a spacer here, 440 nut, tighten it down against the tower. I put a couple of extra spacers in here. These are two spacers, just to give me enough clearance between the shock and the springs and the shock tower. And then just tighten down with a lock nut at top, and then you're good to go. That way I don't have to deal with these guys, because I was having some trouble with those. Another thing I did is I replaced the Losi front arms with JC Racing Products front arms. So they are making reproduction XX front arms, which are a bit thicker And let me see if I can pull up the Losi parts. Oh, I got them right here. Hold on a second. Let me just pull them out of the bag so I can see it more clearly. Okay, so this is the Losi arm, and this is the JC Racing Products arm. So as you can see, okay, the material around the webbing is thicker, so that should make this a stronger arm. All right, and main reason I got these is because I think these are my only pair of XX front arms, and they're pretty hard to find on eBay. Apparently finding XX4 front arms is easier, so I figured I would get these JC Racing Products arms and use those as the default arms. They should be stronger, and it allows me to add some strength to the front end without adding a whole ton of weight, as opposed to, for example, using an aluminum front bulkhead, which, although I like the idea, at least on this particular chassis, I'm going to lay off on that because it's a mid-motor chassis and I don't want to add too much weight up front. So I figure if I could at least have stronger front arms and then couple that with this brace here, I think this might be like a B3 front brace. This will allow me to protect the front bulkhead. So I have a light front bulkhead, if you will, a molded bulkhead. Stronger arms, should be good to go in terms of durability. The only thing is with these arms, there's two things to note. First, there's a little bit of inconsistency in the molding of the holes. So these hinge pins here don't immediately slot into the holes in the arms. You may have to drill those out. I think on this arm I didn't have a problem, but on this one I did. I had to drill it out. Same thing for this hole here. So if I remember correctly, this is a 3/32 inch hole, and this one's a 1/8 inch hole. So I had to bore these out a little bit, but on this arm, I did not have to do that. They slotted through just fine. So a little bit of variation there. And also the placement of these bottom mounting holes for the shocks are actually slightly different. And the reason for that is because, as you can probably see, there is a little bit of extra material here around the holes compared to the Losi arm, where you just have this basically straight shot of plastic and then 3 holes that are drilled in. Here you see these little circles here surrounding each hole. Okay, so there's a bit more material here, and what that means is the spacing between these holes is a little bit larger than what it is on the Losi arm. So the inside hole, I think, is in the same exact position as what it is on between the Losi arm and the JC Racing arm. Let me see if I can line these holes up just right. Okay, so here you can see the inside hole is in the, let's call it the correct position or the same position. And then if you go all the way to the outside hole, you see on the JC Racing Products arm, that hole is just a little bit further out to the right than on the Losi arm. And that middle hole is somewhere in the middle. There's a slight offset. So what this basically means is you do have a different shock angle between the middle and outer holes compared to the stock arm, although the inner hole should be the same. And so if you're worried about droop, if you want to get to the same exact droop as you would have on the outer hole compared to the Losi arms, you'd have to use either a longer eyelet here at the shock end, or take this eyelet and unscrew it by a couple of turns just to recover, so to get a slightly longer shock and to recover your droop. Okay, it's a minor thing, but it's a little detail that may be important for you. Okay. By the way, I didn't do that with these shocks. I just kept them as they are, so I am accepting a little bit less front droop. I'm not too worried about that with this particular car, though, at least not yet. So that's all set. Wings painted, body's painted, everything mounts. I have to say, with this particular body, the XX body is really meant as a rear motor body, and so it looks a bit long when you mount it on a mid-motor car, especially on this side, because I don't need as much of a cutout here to accommodate like the gear cover that you have on this side. So you have all this extra material on the back in here, and it does make the body look kind of long, which, not too crazy about, but it still looks decent. It's an interesting car. The other thing is, I did notice, and I commented on this a little bit in the previous video, how the T-plate on this particular build that I'm doing is bent a little bit to the back. And you can tell by the shock tower also being slightly bent to the back. You see that? So this is pointing perfectly straight up and down. That there's the shock tower. And compared to the vertical, there is a slight backwards angle. So the way that I mounted the 2 screws through the chassis into the front of the motor plate to try to brace it down, I must have drilled those 2 holes maybe a little bit too far back, and it after screwing them in, it probably pushed everything slightly back, which is probably why when I mounted the B6 wing mounts and put this wing on, it looked like the wing was leaning back a little bit, because the tower is actually leaning back just a bit. Again, though, this is a custom build. I can't, it's hard to make it exact when you're hand modifying things. So not a huge deal to me. If anything, like geometrically, what's it going to do? It's probably going to increase the rear anti-squat a little bit, because that T-plate has a fixed position for both the anti-squat and the rear toe-in. It's a single arm mount that covers both of those. So if anything, that's one thing I don't really like about this mid-motor XX compared to the Kyosho Rampage Pro. Let me actually go get that out so you can see. This here is my standard bearer for vintage mid-motor 2-wheel drive buggies, and for good reason. It's very strong, and on top of that, it's more tunable. All these options here on the back, but furthermore, you have this rear inner arm mount that is adjustable. This is a 5-degree mount. You can also get, I think, a 3-degree mount, and if you wanted to, you can put spacers between the chassis and the mount if you have a longer screw to go through here to change your anti-squat. So if I want less anti-squat, I can put more spacers under here to flatten out the anti-squat. You can't do that on this car because that T-plate is one molded piece that covers the anti-squat and the toe-in. Okay, so you can get a different T-plate for different toe-in and maybe different anti-squat. I'm not completely sure how many T-plates they offered, but that's it. It's not easily tunable. Hopefully the T-plate that's on here as it is good enough for the track I will end up running this at. But again, we'll see. This one, still a better car though, by a long shot. All right, let me just put this on the surface over here. So, other than that, I'd say that it's still a pretty cool car. I've just been running it around in the basement here and doing some like jump testing and stuff, and it runs nicely. I think it'll drive well. So I will probably take this to the Vintage Off-Road Nationals this year, at least as a backup car to see how it goes. The other 2 cars I am bringing is my Kyosho Pro X, the rear motor Pro X, and the Traxxas TRX3. Those were my front-up options for this year for Vonats, and they remain my front-up options because I want to basically try to win the class with a rear motor buggy. But depending on how the track goes and depending on how I like this car on the track, I may or may not actually race with it. So we'll see. But in any case, I hope you guys got a kick out of me hacking up a Losi XX. I know to some people that's probably the worst thing you can do to such a nice car. But I had fun with this project. I thought it was very interesting and surprisingly straightforward to turn into a mid-motor buggy with some slight modification. So that's it for now. Thanks for watching.